Testing, testing, bananas and cheese. Got me? Awesome. So up now we have Christian Skoorsmith, and he is talking about working with transgender clients. I'm going to just be completely glued to the screen whilst you talk, Christian, honestly, because this is one of those things, like, without going too deeply, I was raised in a family where my dad, like, because I'm 40 years old now, where my dad actively said that men who loved men were poofters. And I remember thinking, what's wrong with you? He just loves another man. What's wrong with that? Like, love is love. So far away, darling, because I'm all in on this one. So take the show away.
Fantastic. Thank you guys for inviting me to be part of the conference and for putting this kind of event together. And for being open to having this kind of conversation in a professional context.
Oh,
Because
totally.
as you and I were talking about in the preliminary interview, this is just more increasingly becoming a part of our general culture, of Western culture, increasingly part of the accepted dialogue, communication, expression, yeah, and so more and more professional helping or helping professionals like hypnotists are going to see more and more of these kinds of clients that are out and even sharing part of that experience in the context of what they're going to want to do in hypnosis. So I'm just going to go ahead and start sharing my screen to put in to give you a slideshow. Hold on. Okay. Can you all see that without any interference? Fantastic. So
Looking good.
fantastic. So again, my name is Christian Skoorsmith. I'm a hypnotist, hypnotherapist in Seattle, Washington, in the USA. And over the past several years, 5, 6 years, I've really made it a strong emphasis of my practice to make my practice an explicitly safe place for transgender clients. And I'm not transgender myself, I should say at the outset. So I'm speaking not as a member of the community, but as an ally. And so from the perspective of someone who needs to be onboarded and brought on that journey from the cisgender perspective. And so that's sort of the context for this work. And then since then, I've actually been speaking to conferences like this all around the world, talking to them about what it's like to work with transgender clients. Because, like as we said, this is going to be increasingly part of the work that we do, part of the clientele that we're servicing, and I want to make sure that we as cisgender people are doing the best we can to meet the needs and be in the space, make our own clinics a welcoming space for transgender clients. So my website's there if you want more information about me. But before we begin talking about this topic, I really want to make sure that we have some ground rules or some fundamental assumptions. The first one is that I'm assuming that the work we're doing is fundamentally affirming. That well, I'm not. This is not talking about how to hypnotize people to not be transgender or or corrective therapy or all kinds of ways to try to unmake someone transgender. I think a lot of the traffic that I get on my website about working with transgender clients actually comes from this kind of curiosity about whether someone can be hypnotized to not be, and typically it's parents wanting me to work with their kids. And so one of the things that I actually expressly talk to them about is that that's not what I do. That's actually not ethical. It's actually not it's not even legal in Washington State. I'm not sure about Australia.
It's
And
not legal in Australia either.
okay, well then there we go. So
We're not allowed to
so it's
use
not.
aversion therapy.
Yes, yeah. Oh my goodness. So just as a fundamental ground rule, the work that we're proposing doing with transgender clients must be from the perspective of being fundamentally affirming. And of course, as hypnotists, we know we can't make someone do something that they don't want to do, be something they don't want to be. feel something they don't want to feel, right? Fundamentally, they always have that protective mechanism around. So even if we wanted to, which would be unethical, it would be it wouldn't be fair to the client. So it's not conversion therapy, it's not reprogramming them. In fact, hypnosis and hypnotherapy is best when it's empowering people to be their best, most authentic selves. So I wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page about what I'm talking about here. So like oftentimes people ask like, hey, like what does it mean to be transgender? Because there's a lot of transvestite, transsexual, so there's a lot of languaging around that, and I think it's just kind of helpful to put in the context of here we have the LGBTQ umbrella, and typically we just throw out the LGBTQ moniker, the label there, and oftentimes what we're meaning specifically actually is lesbian, gay, lesbian, bisexual, sometimes, right? We're thinking more in the terms of sexual orientation, which is fair. That's that's an enormous part of our population that needs to have, that's well organized. It needs to have civil rights and equal rights, that sort of thing. But when we're talking about the Q umbrella, the whole community of people that are not in the mainstream, there's also the transgender side of things, whereas gay, lesbian, bisexual, those are sexual orientations, whereas transgender is talking about sexual identity. And so it's not necessarily who you're attracted to, but actually how do you see yourself, which is a fundamentally different kind of question. And it's actually an important distinction to make if you're working at all with youth, because sometimes people will object to even raising the question of transgender identity with little kids, because if they're really little kids, the assumption is that this is going to be this is a sexual kind of conversation. We're talking about sexual preferences or acts or whatnot, and that's not what's going on with being transgender. Transgender is how we see ourselves, the gender we identify with ourselves. And so a little kid at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years old, they can already start to identify that in themselves oftentimes. Not exclusively, certainly, but even as young as that, that's when we start to learn about what it means to be us. And certainly some of them can identify that early. So those are two separate kind of conversations. So we're not talking about sexual orientation in this very brief overall conversation, but also when we're talking about what it means to be transgender, sexual orientation is a different question, related, somewhat overlapping, but it's not the same question. We're talking about sexual identity, gender identity, how we see ourselves. And I'll just lift up at this point that if you do have questions, let's save those for the end, just to make sure I have enough time to get through the core material in the presentation, and then we can actually just open it up and actually have a more earnest and open conversation if you have any questions at that point. So diving a little deeper into what this means when we start talking about gender identity. This is the gender unicorn, right? And because it's the unicorn because it doesn't exist. It's never this easy, right? But here it starts to break out some of how these are understood. First of all, there's the gender identity. How do we see ourselves? How do we imagine ourselves to be? There's that rainbow there, right? Do I see myself as female, woman, a girl, or do I see myself as male, man, a body? There are other genders that might that I can identify myself with. We'll dive into that in just a moment. But that's distinct from gender express. So how I think about myself, how I imagine myself, conceive of myself, is different from how I express to the world. So I can express more masculine. I can express more feminine. I can express in other ways. But my gender expression is actually a distinct act from my gender identity, how I conceive of myself. And so this is a helpful distinction to know when meeting, conversing with, talking with transgender clients about how they move through the world, they can express differently at different times for different reasons in different ways, and that sometimes be reflective of their gender identity and sometimes not. They're again related, somewhat overlapping, but distinct conversations. And all of this is actually distinct from the sex or the gender that was assigned at birth. So typically, so a broad definition of what it means to be transgender is someone who identifies themselves as something, as a gender other than the one they were assigned at birth. Now, I am a cisgendered person, and what that means is cisgendered means that I identify with the gender that I was assigned at birth. And note the language there, that the gender was an assignment from someone else. It came from someone else's perspective. The doctors, the nurses, whoever, the midwife, whoever was there, right? They looked at the baby and they made assumptions about what that baby's gender is based on maybe probably bodily, external factors. But even if they did like a chromosomal analysis or whatnot, we'll talk just briefly about the science behind this. But something that we've learned is that that there is no clear and distinct and absolute marker between in a binary gender sort of system or sex system, even in bald nature, that doesn't exist in that way. So, but the important thing to hold on to here is that this was an assignment. This was their sex assigned at birth by someone else. It's not something that they have adopted. It's not something that they have chosen for themselves. So what they choose is, do they identify, is how they identify themselves in agreement with the assignment that they were given at birth. And I happen to identify more or less with the gender that I was identified with at birth. And a transgender person is someone who, to whatever extent and in whatever way, does not identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth. We can talk more about that in the Q&A section if that's unclear. But I don't want to beat a dead horse, of course, if that's clear. So all of that is distinct also from who we are physically attracted to. And now we're talking about more orientation. Whether someone can be a trans man, means that they were assigned female at birth and they're transitioning or have transitioned to be a man, and they can be sexually attracted to women or men or other genders, or both or all, right? That just like when we are identifying that anyone can be, that sexual attraction can go in any direction. Also, but just being trans does not mean that that isn't the case as well. But I also want to lift up here that they're breaking this out from who you're emotionally attracted to. And this gets into a different kind of conversation that's helpful to have, but it might be a little more than we have time for today. But the idea that who you might be physically attracted to and who you might be emotionally attracted to might not necessarily or always be the same kind of person, which of course begins to open up in a beautiful way a kind of multiplicity, diversity of potential relationships. So when we talk about gender identity, even in the natural world, I don't mean to say it like that, but in the natural world, it's not just male or female. There's not just two kinds of chromosomal compositions. There's not just absolutely only two kinds of physical bodies. No, and we're talking about this. This is true with the human species. This is true with all kinds of species. And so understanding that the binary system, the binary theory, the binary perspective that there's male and female, that's a theory. It's helpful for a certain amount of time and a certain kind of work, but it's not an absolute. It's a description, and it's actually shaping our experience just as much as it is saying something that's true about the world. So there's lots of other theories that might actually be more helpful in a lot of different ways. You could think of this as gender as a spectrum, which for the past like 30 or 40 years, that's actually been a pretty progressive and consistent kind of model that's been lifted up. But now, as we'll talk about in just a minute, as the younger generations have more freedom to explore, then the spectrum itself as actually seems more restrictive and limited. And so you might explode that into a three-dimensional field or a three-dimensional play space where it's not just points along a line, but actually different kinds of potential relationships and placements where we identify ourselves in that gender milieu, that gender play space. Understanding that all of these theories are more of a social construct, and that gender itself is just as much performative as it is formative. But it plays into how we perform, it plays into our identity, plays into politics in the sense, like sometimes like in political parties, but I'm talking more about who has control of the power. And we see this coming up in terms of laws and legalities, that the question of gender, particularly as it becomes more and more diffuse in the younger generations, that becomes more and more troublesome for older generations for whom the idea feels like it should be more fixed. And so the politics is actually a reaction to that ongoing conversation. So I've mentioned this a couple times about generational differences, and that's because not only has our culture's ability to approach this conversation changed, but also the medicine, the kind of the access to healthcare, gender affirming healthcare, surgery, psychology, hormone treatments, other kinds of medicines, has grown by leaps and bounds over the past several generations. So transgender people who are generally 50 years or older, were caught in the gender binary. They thought still very binarily about gender. So if they weren't born, if they didn't identify as the gender they were assigned at birth, that means they were the other gender. And so even today, transgender people who are older will actually still they'll be very binary in this way. But at the same time, they typically have experienced a lot more trauma in transitioning or trying to live as transgender, because there just was not the supportive network, there was not the social dialogue that was going on. There wasn't the psychological help. In fact, only in the most recent diagnostic and statistical manual was being transgender actually moved away from being a diagnosable disorder. So for most of their lives, this has been being transgender was a disorder, and only recently has that changed. So they're going to have a lot of their stories have to deal with the trauma of self-discovery, of being trans, of trying to find medical care. There's a lot of pathos in their stories. Now, transgender people who are in their 30s and 40s, they're still generally binary in their thinking, because that's how our culture was when we were growing up. But there's generally less trauma when we're talking about their stories about transitioning and being able to live trans. And that's because there's been a lot more there's gender affirming healthcare, as far as there's been like a lot more advances in plastic surgery, availability for that. There's been psychological support. Hormone therapy has advanced. So people in their 30s and 40s, they're going to be their stories are not as laden with the kind of generational trauma that people in their 50s or older will have. There's also another difference here, in that people who are 50s and older, typically you'll be able to, well, and this is very general speaking here, but typically it's easier to identify transgender people who are in their 50s or older, as transgender because typically they've had to wait until their bodies have been well developed. They've had to wait until their 20s, 30s, 50s before being able to have that kind of transition. And so, but on the other hand, people in their 30s and 40s who have had more access and earlier access to those kinds of resources, you may never tell that they're transgender unless they volunteer it for you. Now, people in their 20s, they're still now. Of course, when I was giving when I started giving this talk about 5 or 6 years ago, I mean, this may change because people have gotten older, right? But people in their 20s, generally, they're still binary in their thinking, but there's going to be a lot more self-esteem, a lot of self-worth. They will have had access to hormone therapy a lot earlier. So, and maybe even prepubescent and pubescent access to that, pubescent access to hormone blockers, and then hormone therapy. So they might have only gone through one kind of puberty, the kind of puberty that they identify with. So, and then this actually just feeds into the teen experience. People who are younger, younger than in their 20s or in their early 20s at this point, their experience has been so profoundly different than what is than what was seen in earlier generations. Because for the teens, they've come of age in a time when the gay, lesbian, bisexual rights have been in place, where a lot more anti-bullying programs or diversity programs have been more in place, school support, psychological support, hormone therapy. There's been just a general, and then the presence of the internet and all those kinds of resources. Any resource in the globe, there's going to be a lot more discussion about what's going on, not just who you can find in your own town that is like you, but actually having now access to a whole global network. It's really exploded this conversation. So now gender identity is less and less being associated actually with physical characteristics. And so it's not being restricted to certainly just a binary, but also now you can now there's all kinds of variants. You can be demi male or a demi boy or a demi girl or mostly male or mostly female or well, like any number of things. In fact, one of my the child of one of my good friends, they very early on were identifying as transgender, as more masculine. They were assigned female at birth. And as they got older, that became more and more pronounced. And in their teens, they started living more a non-binary life. And then in their early 20s, they started taking testosterone. And, their voice started deepening and a little facial hair. And so I had an opportunity to talk to them. And I was saying, so like now that you're taking testosterone, does that mean that you're more masculine identifying? And they said to me, well, so I'm only about 95% male and 5% undecided. And I said to him, that's everybody. That's actually more masculine than I feel, right? I mean, like if I don't feel a 95% like a man, right? There's this expectation in younger generations that they can have this very expansive, varied, very personal and descriptive way of talking about their own gender identity. It's another way to play without being insincere or pejorative about that, but to play with who they are. And I don't see that at all lessening. One way we can see this taking place is in the explosion of pronouns. So now probably most of us grew up with three kinds of pronouns: the masculine, feminine, and the neutral or neuter, the indefinite pronoun. So masculine being he, him, feminine, she, her, hers, and the indefinite being they, them, right? And so they, them is both a plural and also an indefinite singular. It's been that way since before Shakespeare. Like there's using they, them as a singular pronoun when you don't know the pronoun, or the pronoun isn't, or it isn't male or female. It's a totally legitimate way, and it has a long pedigree in the English language. But in addition to those three, now there are more and more. In fact, a transgender, somebody who runs a transgender support network, he's of an older generation, and he actually jokes. He says, "I can't keep up. It seems like every week there's a new pronoun out there. I can't keep up with it." Right? And you can see there's certainly that generational difference when he says that. But here is so she, he, they, and z, and it could be here, zir, as the object of possessive is here's, zir's, here self, zir self, right? And there's just so many more as possibilities. So there's z, si, I, they, te, and there might be ones that like there's more than these. There's you can easily just Google pronouns, and there's probably more than we could even go into. But typically, when you're working with people, very rarely do I work with people who use these kinds of pronouns. So typically, I just use they for general use. Just seems it's just safer, it's easier, it's already part of the grammar of our minds. And I'd say, when in doubt, just use the person's name. It's totally, I mean, it only sounds clunky at the very beginning. Just use the name, and it works just fine. The reason why we want to lift up talking about pronouns is because in particular advanced techniques in hypnosis, it actually becomes really important, because typically when you're working with a client, you'll be addressing them as you, right, or by their name. You don't refer to them in the third person, but in specific techniques that you actually do refer to the client, or at least part of the client, in the third person. And one of these is when we're working with age regression. And in age regression, if you're working with clients, you'll want to make sure that they're identifying the gender of the earlier experiences in their lives. Now, sometimes they write that their present gender, the gender that they identify themselves with, throughout their whole lives, and they might have experienced that the whole time, and it was just other people giving them, assigning them the other gender or an other gender. But sometimes, particularly if they didn't come to that realization until later in their lives, or have the permission to explore that, they might actually refer to their earlier selves in the gender that they were assigned at birth, or the gender that they were living at that point. So you have to pay special attention to the genders of the earlier experiences in age regression. If it's unclear, you might use something that has no gender at all, right? Just refer to them by the age that they are. You might refer to them as little one, right? Because little one is delightfully, it's accurate and also gender non-specific. Also, in any sort of parts therapy, I mean, here I talk about chair therapy, right? But any sort of parts therapy, we're going to be talking about the other part or the other parts, right? Whether that's in Gestalt or family systems, whatever it is, particularly like when you're in chair therapy, it's really important that the other parts respect the pronoun that the client wants to use. So particularly if you're working in chair therapy with an offender, when you're wanting to work with like forgiveness of others, or have it out with somebody who is the offender, right? The offender must use the proper pronoun, right? And you can establish at the very outset, when you're talking about the rules of the situation, the rules of the room, the rules of the chair, of the conversation, that the offender can't do anything without the permission of either the client or the hypnotist, right? So they cannot use the improper pronoun. It's just really important to make sure that we're we're lifting up the dignity of the client as they see themselves with that. And then also when we're talking about forgiveness of self, right? Sometimes in that technique, we break out the parts between the client as they are, and then also sort of break out into the mistake-making part, for lack of a better term, right? And then, when we have it out with the mistake-making part, trying to understand like why they were making those mistakes. And when we're doing that, it's important to assume that the gender of that mistake, the gender of the other part, is the same gender that the person identifies with, unless they want to make that distinction that it's not. It's important to have that be the same, so that we're not creating a conflict where it doesn't need to exist. So I want to make sure we have enough time to talk about questions, but also really like sort of just touch on some of these key ideas about working with transgender clients. So there's two broad ways that hypnotists can work with transgender clients. I mean, so transgender people are people, right? So they can benefit from hypnosis in the way that everybody can. So there's this sense in which we want to be able to work with transgender people just in whatever they're doing. Then also being also open to working with transgender people through particular issues of their transition. And I go into quite a bit more detail into this in a different presentation that you guys will have access to it. But just to briefly sort of walk through some of the important dynamics of both of those is that it's, as with any client, of course, but particularly working with transgender clients, it's really important to establish rapport from the very beginning, because with trans clients have had they've had a long history of negative experience, particularly with mental health professionals, with the medical establishment, right? It's been a hard fought journey, laden with a lot of misunderstanding and mistrust. And so one of the ways, there's a couple things that we can do to help establish that rapport, excuse me. And the first is to accept their identity, right? As a matter of fact, there's no question, there's no doubt, feeling free to ask any questions you want, but not in any way give any indication that you wouldn't accept their identity as who they are. Get used to using pronouns. You have to, if you need to, practice this on yourself all the time. Use self-hypnosis, right? Make sure that even if it's classical conditioning, just say their name, their pronoun, have a picture of them in your mind, say it over and over and over again, so there's no slip-ups. If you do slip up, that's fine, as long as you acknowledge it, daylight it, apologize for it, and be willing to make that amends, and then jump back in and try your best, right? But proper pronoun use goes a long way with transgender clients. Feel free to ask questions, but fundamentally be affirming of their journey. One of the ways you can do this is just ask for their story, right? This might also be a way to establish rapport, but also gain background knowledge about what their issues are and what might be coming up. And ask about social transition versus surgical transition. I don't think I have a slide here talking about there's 3 different kinds of transitions. So there's social transitioning, where you dress differently, you cut your hair, you start presenting as the gender you identify with, right? And that's usually the first one. That's because it's the easiest, right? And it's the easiest to undo. It's the easiest to play with. But then there's also surgical transitioning, which is, as you might imagine, that's when we start to do more medical interventions. And so the line between social and surgical transitions, when we're talking about hormone treatment, that's more of a conversation. But certainly surgeries, top surgeries and bottom surgeries are a major investment. I mean, it's tens of thousands of dollars oftentimes, and not covered by insurance most of the time. And then legal transition, And that's where you change your gender markers, gender name, or your name on official documents, legal documents, bank accounts, driver's license, passport, those sorts of things. Those are the three general kinds of transitioning. They're the most significant. And none of them are dependent on each other, but typically they come in that order. So typically social, and then either surgical or legal, and then the other one. Okay, another issue that transgender clients might find helpful with is pain management, particularly if they're undergoing surgery. If there's a female to male client, sometimes they'll wear binders around the top to suppress the breasts. There's a lot of very, very difficult body changes, hormonal induced body changes. There's enlargement, there's sensitivity, there's discomfort, there's all kinds of things where pain management might be helpful. If you've had experience in training in pain management, that might be a really good asset to bring to your work with people going through transition. But also anger management, particularly forgiveness work, because there's going to be a lot of issues, typically, especially with older generations, a lot of issues with family and friends whose reactions may have been hurtful or misunderstanding or sometimes violent, economically disruptive, right? And being able to distinguish between the hurts and the wrongs as being wrong, but then also being able to let them go so they're not holding the client back anymore. We talked a little bit about age regression, but this is a really great technique to establish the goodness of this child, right, of our inner child, and validate the journey that little child is on, and give that little child in the past the confidence that, yes, you will discover this. What you think is an issue will become part of a beautiful part of your identity, sort of thing, right? And also body imaging, particularly with not just like weight loss and muscle tone, but also with voice. Ego strengthening and resilience is, of course, it's good for everybody, particularly with transgender clients. I want to make sure we have enough time for questions, so I'm just going to assume that we're all convinced of the value of ego strengthening and building resilience in clients. Resilience in the sense of being able to recognize the wrongs, but not have them be nearly as impactful. Almost like setting up this, I say here, like a protective shield for the client. One of my favorite examples is to talk about the differences between a chicken and a duck, and to ask if they've ever seen a chicken swim. Right? And of course, the chickens can't swim because water goes right through their feathers, and so they actually sink. And that's not entirely true, because sometimes they do float. The problem is they float upside down, which isn't that helpful, right? So, but the thing is, so if it ever just even rains a little bit, you see the chickens just all scattering because the water is going to go right through their feathers and get them cold. But a duck can stand in the rain. It doesn't matter. The duck can float, it can swim, it like dives down into that. So no matter what's going on around the duck, because it has that protective layer, can go through that life brilliantly, right? And so the one problem is that typically we go through life thinking we're a chicken, but we're not. We're a duck, and we can have that protective coating. We don't need to let everybody else's rain get through to us, that sort of thing. So I have some slides for takeaways here. Key takeaways. The first is pronouns. Really become very proficient at pronouns, using the appropriate pronouns, and particularly when we're talking about age regression, it's really key to use the pronoun of how they were identifying at that time. Also establishing trust, and this may require a lot more time and effort than you might be used to with clients in the general population, because of how much bad experience they've had with the medical community. So you might need to spend a lot more time building that kind of rapport, that kind of trust, whether that's starting with progressive relaxation, making sure they're comfortable. You might even consider like a happy age regression to a time when they felt wonderful, and just soak up that goodness for a while to help them become proficient and comfortable at being in the state of hypnosis and being led by you. I'd also say open up the gender identifier on your intake forms. So don't ask for M or F, right? Or have say circle male or female, or even male, female, and other. I have gender on my intake forms, but it says just gender, and it's just a blank space, right? And it just leaves it open for them to fill in whatever they want. Now, it's a small thing, which for cisgender people we won't even think about it. Well, we know what to put in there, right? So it won't matter to any cisgender person that you don't have the M or F that you can circle, but it's going to mean so much for transgender clients to have the freedom to tell their own story. Right? And either instead of or in addition to the legal name on the intake forms, you might have a preferred name space, right? Now, this could be for like a cisgender person. A cisgender person's going to think, oh, that's just like a nickname, right? And that's fine. Like instead of Stephen, I'd much rather you call me Steve, right? But for a transgender person, the preferred name might actually be substantially different than the legal name. And in fact, in many cases, I don't even know if we need the legal name unless you're working with insurance. But that's, the laws may differ where you are. And then I'd also say explicitly identify your own preferred pronouns in every communication, like your email signatures, website. Like even I have it on my Zoom name right there. I have the little parentheses, he, him, right? And what this does is it normalizes people volunteering their own identity. They're volunteering that how they would like to be addressed, right? And then another is explicitly identify on your websites a transgender friendly position. And don't just assume that saying, oh, I'm LGBTQ friendly, or putting up a rainbow flag or something like that is good enough. Because as we saw in the umbrella, most of the time what people mean when they say LGBTQ, they're not thinking about the T, right? They're not thinking about the trans community. They're thinking about gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer sort of thing. So really actually make sure that you have it spelled out that this is an area that you have a passion for, that you really want to make your practice a safe place for transgender clients. And then when you have an intake interview, ask affirmatively about their transition, right? Like, how has it been since you've transitioned socially? How long has that been? Tell me about that process. Tell me your story, right? In the same way as you do when you meet a new couple, like a newlywed couple, right? What you do is you ask them, like, tell me how you met, right? Tell me the story, cast the tale for me, right? And we want to do that same thing with transgender clients. Another takeaway is don't assume that you know or act like you know what the transgender experience is like. The transgender community is not monolithic. Everybody is they're still individuals, their own journeys. Allow them to shape their own narrative for you. First of all, that gives them the power, but it also gives you more information, right? So you're not working from your assumptions. You're actually working from their material, conscious and unconscious material. And I would say, as much as you can, get the contact or referral information for all of their relevant healthcare professionals. So their general practitioner, the therapist, the psychologists, any specialists or surgeons, non-licensed helpers like voice coaches, right? And so you want to be part of the constellation of care for two reasons. One is so that you have a network that you can work with to help support that particular client. But then also because then it's networking, right? And so when this voice coach has another client that's going through a difficult time, they have a hypnotist that they can refer their clients to. And so you really want to make sure that you're working within a community of helping professionals. And lastly, link if you really want to like drive home any suggestion, link it to personal integrity, right? Being true to oneself. Now, this is a great this is a great tactic for anybody, but particularly for it's a resonant theme with transgender clients. Also, transgender clients are typically very self-aware, and so we can use that for that. I already mentioned that the trans community is not monolithic or uniform. Just let everybody be their own person. Now, there's a lot more to be said. If you're interested, there's a 2-hour presentation that I gave at the National Guild of Hypnotists convention last year. That's online. It's on my website. I think it's like $25, and you can watch it as many times as you want. Slow it down. And there's some supplemental materials there. If you do have any questions, and also a book that I'm finishing up about this will be released early next year. And if you have any questions, feel free to call, text, email, like reach out. I love to talk about these issues, and I want all of us to be better at it. So that having been said, let's go ahead and open it up. I don't know how much time we have for questions, but Trish, maybe you could.
Yeah, about 2 minutes.
Okay.
So yeah, does anybody have any questions? Otherwise, we can email questions through. Like we understand that, you know, time is short with a lot of this stuff. No. So the only thing that I wanted to add to it as well is the next what I perceive as next level stuff, and that's where we bring in things like polyamory, monogamy, polymono. And for those of you who don't know what that sort of stuff is, that's where you have different sexual partners into the relationships as well. So this can go even bigger than this. So Val, what was your question, darling?
I do a lot of past life regression, Christian, and I'm just wondering how many are actually caught up in that change quite unwittingly about changing from male to female or vice versa.
Well, so that's a great question, broad topic, and I am, you know, even apart from the shortness of our time, I'm not really qualified to talk about past life regression. It's not a strength area of mine for that. But you know, like, so I'll just throw this out there that past life regression experience might be a past life, might be something that they're actually bringing with them. It might also be a way that their subconscious is wrestling with the various issues around their own gender identity, right? I mean, I can totally imagine that would be a way that the subconscious would be trying to figure that out.
Yeah. You don't want to hear this, but I worked as a mental health nurse, so I had to work with quite a few that were transitioning. But I have to say I was very worried about the strength of their psychology assessment. And sometimes we found that people didn't really want to transition at all. You know, for instance, one young man was just simply scared of having a penis, believing that he had the ability to rape somebody, had absolutely no intention of doing so.
Wow.
Very, very nice, passive young man. And yet something had happened where he thought that he just might, simply because he's equipped to do so. He was too shy. The reason why we were involved is that he had severe social anxiety. He was transitioning, didn't even want the neighbours to see that he was starting to grow breasts, you know, with chemical treatment. So do you have any concerns about the initial psychological assessments that are being done for people that say perhaps they ought to be a woman, not a man, but there may be reasons about that really don't necessitate a gender change? Well,
so that's actually one really great thing about the care that's coming out now is that it's so particularly with younger generations. There's not the strict expectation that everything's going to line up in the traditional way. Like you can be a boy with breasts, you can be a girl with a penis, right? You can that there's a lot. The younger generation, the younger you go, the more expansive that understanding is, and the less it becomes tied to specific physical characteristics. That doesn't answer your question like directly, but it would probably. It would probably be well.
I think to add to this as well is that this is new territory, even though it's been around for like, you know, like quite a few years now. When it comes to the medical industry, for every one day that goes past, we're 10 years behind studies and medications and ramifications and things like that. So, you know, this is new territory, and it will still be new territory for another 5 to 10 years yet.
Mm.
So yeah, we're still learning a lot from all of this, and then, you know, we're going into next level stuff, because there's a lot of people that not so much when it comes to trans or anything, but they're literally getting arms and legs chopped off because they'd rather be bionic. So we've got a lot of learning
Wow.
to do
Yeah. Fascinating.
about psychology, especially as more technology comes
Val,
through.
it's
it's a
I'd say
great
Val,
question, though.
reach out to me. Like, let's continue having this conversation, because it sounds like there's more backstory that needs to be talked about.
There is, yeah. I'm very, very concerned about those assessments. Because we were involved trying to treat people with so-called schizophrenia. But really, if the psychologists had done their jobs properly, they would have realised that a bit of persuasion, a bit of hypnotherapy, could have convinced. Well, I don't want to hold the floor. I know we're running out of time, but one chap that was diagnosed with schizophrenia believed that his girlfriend rejected him because she had fallen in love with another girl. It wasn't true. That was part of his delusion. She actually married a guy and had children, for God's sake. But he was completely and utterly mixed up after that. And I really do believe with a bit of helpful hypnotherapy that you would have been offering, he could have maintained his male status without all the stuff that went on. It was just problematic. So I'd really love to see that better psychology assessments are made. I wonder whether there's a vested interest in getting these operations going and a big payout. And if you don't mind me saying, I'm very worried about young children. I know that some are very convinced that they're the opposite sex, but it's a normal thing for teenagers to have crushes on their own sex, trying to find their own identity. But certainly by 17, 18, they've got a good idea that they are who they are. And yet it seems to be younger and younger. They're being persuaded to say, you know, you get your sex change made before they're really emotionally ready to make that big decision.
I would agree with that. Absolutely.
Thanks, Trish. It's scary.
It is very,
it's so scary. And if you could see the botched up surgery that happens, you know, with these he-she's that just are setting themselves up to be laughed at for many, many years because those changes are irreversible.
Yes.
I find it's almost on the borderline of being, I wonder how much ethics is actually involved in having a look at what's going on with psychologists and surgeons?
Well, so I don't know what the situation is in Australia, but I know that for gender affirming surgeries, there's a number of sign-offs that need to take place between several different mental health professionals before those can take place. So there's a lot of safeguards, more and more to that.
Golly, the sort of people that we had to see, and once they trusted you to a certain extent, you know, and the stories they were telling just didn't match up to what you felt should have been done in those in-depth assessments. You know,
let's have a conversation more offline about that.
Absolutely. So I do have to pause everybody there. So we've got Karen DeMole up next, but absolutely, I think we should definitely open this up for constructive conversation for the future. So thank you so much, Christian. Thank you everybody for attending. So jump on over to the next ones, because we've got Karen DeMole talking about Hear with Sounds. Okay, see you everybody.
Bye.
Bye.